The first time I saw a human die, I thought they were the weakest species in the galaxy. Commander Vexthal had warned us that the new Terran recruits were fragile, their bones brittle, their skin soft as flower petals. When Private Martinez took a plasma bolt to the chest during our first joint patrol on Kepler 442b, he dropped like a stone, crimson liquid pouring from a wound. The other species in our squad barely flinched when injured, but this human just collapsed, making awful choking sounds. I am Kreltar of the Vorthak Empire, a warrior bred for combat across 17 star systems. My exoskeleton can deflect small arms fire. My 4 arms allow me to wield multiple weapons simultaneously, and my metabolism can sustain me for weeks without sustenance. Standing over the dying human, I felt nothing but disappointment. How had these soft creatures ever left their home world, let alone joined the Galactic Defense Coalition? The human squad leader, Sergeant Chun, knelt beside Martinez without regard for the ongoing firefight around us. Covenant forces were advancing through the crystalline formations that covered this moon's surface, their energy weapons casting eerie blue shadows across the battlefield. Any rational soldier would have sought cover, but Chin stayed exposed, pressing her hands against Martinez's wound. "Medic!" she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos of battle. The sound was unlike anything I had heard before, raw and desperate in a way that seemed almost primitive. My species communicates through subsonic frequencies and chemical signals. We do not waste energy on such emotional displays. Private Rodriguez, another human, broke from his position behind a crystal outcropping and sprinted across open ground toward his fallen comrade. Covenant plasma bolts seared the air around him, one passing so close to his head that it singed his hair. He dove the final few meters, sliding across the rough ground and tearing his uniform. Blood seeped through the fabric where the sharp crystals had cut him, but he ignored his own injuries. "I've got him, Sarge," Rodriguez said, already unpacking medical supplies from his kit. His hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the tremor I could detect in them. Fear, I realized. These humans were afraid, yet they continued to function. Martinez's eyes were wide and unfocused, his breathing rapid and shallow. The plasma bolt had punched through his body armor and into his lung. Pink foam bubbled from his lips with each labored breath. By Vorthak standards, he was already dead. Our warriors would have accepted their fate and used their remaining moments to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. But these humans refused to accept the inevitable. "Stay with us, Martinez," Chun commanded, her weapon trained on the advancing Covenant forces while she maintained verbal contact with her dying subordinate. "Think about Maria and the kids. You're going home to them." I watched in fascination as Rodriguez worked. His medical training was far more advanced than anything our species possessed. We either survived our wounds through superior physiology, or we died. The concept of intervention seemed foreign and wasteful. Yet here was this fragile creature, trying to repair another fragile creature in the middle of a combat zone. The Covenant forces pressed their advantage, recognizing that the humans had divided their attention. 3 Sanghaili warriors bounded across the crystal formations within human grace, their energy swords crackling with lethal power. I raised my plasma cannon to engage them, but Chin was faster. Her rifle barked 3 times in rapid succession. Each shot found its mark, dropping the Sanghaili before they could close distance. The precision was remarkable, but what struck me more was the cold fury in her eyes. She killed without hesitation, without mercy, then immediately returned her attention to Martinez as if nothing had happened. "Got the bleeding stopped," Rodriguez reported, "but he needs real medical attention." Now, Chin activated her communications device. "Overlord, this is Bravo 7. We need immediate dust-off for wounded. Grid reference follows." The response crackled through static-filled speakers. "Negative, Bravo 7. Landing zone too hot. Continue mission parameters." I expected acceptance. In Vorthak military doctrine, the needs of the mission always superseded individual casualties. But Chin's response surprised me. Overlord, that was not a request. I have a soldier dying. Send the fucking bird. The profanity was unnecessary, inefficient. Yet something in her tone made it clear this was not open for negotiation. A few moments later, the radio crackled again. Bravo 7, be advised. Medevac inbound. ETA 4 minutes. Mark your position. Rodriguez fired a flare into the air, painting the sky in brilliant red light. The Covenant forces immediately began concentrating fire on our position, recognizing that we were calling for extraction. Energy bolts scorched the crystal formations around us, sending superheated fragments flying like shrapnel. We need to move, I told Chun in my carefully practiced English. This position is compromised. She looked at me with those strange, wet eyes that humans possessed. We're not leaving Martinez. He is dying, I pointed out, stating what seemed obvious. Tactical withdrawal would preserve the rest of the unit. Then you withdraw, Chen said. I'm staying. The irrationality of it frustrated me. These humans seemed determined to waste resources on futile gestures. Yet as I watched the squad rally around their wounded comrade, something unexpected happened. Private Johnson, who had been pinned down by sniper fire, suddenly broke cover and laid down suppressing fire with reckless abandon. Corporal Singh and Lance Corporal Williams flanked the enemy position, moving with coordinated precision despite having no formal orders to do so. They were not following doctrine. They were following something else entirely. The medevac arrived as promised, its engines screaming as it descended through withering enemy fire. The pilot, another human whose call sign was Ghost, maneuvered the aircraft with impossible skill, using the crystal formations as cover while maintaining enough stability for the medical team to operate. 2 minutes, the crew chief shouted over the noise. Medical personnel leaped from the aircraft before it had fully landed, racing toward Martinez with equipment I did not recognize. Their movements were swift, professional, desperate. Chun and her squad maintained defensive positions while the medics worked. I found myself studying their faces, trying to understand what I was seeing. Fear was there, certainly, but also determination. Hope. They genuinely believed they could save Martinez, despite all evidence to the contrary. The medical team loaded Martinez onto a stretcher and ran for the aircraft. Chun personally carried one end, refusing to delegate the task to others. As they reached the medevac, Martinez's eyes found hers. Tell Maria, he whispered. Tell her yourself, Chun replied. When you get home, the aircraft lifted off, disappearing into the planet's turbulent atmosphere. We resumed our patrol as if nothing had happened, but I found myself watching the humans differently. They moved with the same tactical proficiency as before, but there was something else now, an edge I had not noticed previously. When we encountered the next Covenant patrol an hour later, the difference became apparent. The humans fought with control violence that shocked me. Every shot was placed with surgical precision. Every movement was calculated for maximum lethality. They gave no quarter, showed no mercy, and took no prisoners. I had seen Vorthack warriors in combat many times. We fought with honor, following ancient codes of conduct even in the heat of battle. These humans fought like something else entirely. They fought like creatures that understood loss in ways my species could not comprehend. During a brief lull in combat, I approached Sergeant Chun. "You Martinez," I said carefully. "Will he survive?" Chin's expression was unreadable. "Maybe. Probably. Human medicine is pretty advanced. But you could not know this when you called for extraction." "No," she admitted. "We couldn't." "Then, why risk the squad for an uncertain outcome?" Chun studied me for a long moment. "Because he's one of us," she said finally. "And we don't leave our people behind." The simplicity of the statement confused me. Vorthack philosophy emphasized the collective over the individual, but in practical terms this meant accepting losses when they occurred. These humans seemed to believe in the collective so deeply that they would risk everything for a single member. As we continued our patrol, I began to notice other things about human behavior that had previously escaped my attention. They shared their rations without being asked. They took turns on watch duty, even when exhausted. When Rodriguez's weapon jammed during a firefight, Johnson immediately provided covering fire without any communication between them. They functioned as a unit in ways that transcended mere military training. There was genuine affection between them, genuine concern for each other's welfare. When Corporal Singh mentioned that his daughter had taken her first steps in a message from home, the entire squad celebrated as if she were their own child. My species reproduced through careful genetic selection and artificial gestation. Young Vorthak were raised communally and trained for birth for their designated roles. The concept of family bonds was foreign to us, an evolutionary artifact that most advanced species had discarded eons ago. Yet watching these humans, I began to wonder if we had discarded something important. The thought troubled me throughout the remainder of our patrol. When we finally returned to base 6 days later, I learned that Private Martinez had indeed survived his injuries. He was being transferred to a medical facility on Earth for extended rehabilitation, but he would live. The squad's reaction was one of genuine joy, as if they had achieved a significant military victory. I filed my mission report with characteristic Vorthak efficiency, noting tactical observations and enemy capabilities encountered. But I found myself struggling with how to categorize what I had witnessed among the humans. Their behavior did not fit standard military classifications, yet it had clearly influenced their effectiveness as a fighting unit. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to human behavior patterns. During training exercises, they pushed themselves far beyond their apparent physical limitations. A human soldier who seemed exhausted could continue fighting for hours if their comrades were in danger. Their pain tolerance, while limited compared to Vorthak physiology, was apparently enhanced by psychological factors I did not understand. Most intriguingly, their emotional responses seemed to improve rather than hinder their combat performance. A human who witnessed a friend's injury would fight with increased intensity and focus. Their anger made them more dangerous, not less so. This contradicted everything I had been taught about efficient warfare. Lieutenant Commander Thrall-X, my immediate superior, noticed my interest in human behavior and assigned me to a joint training exercise with Bravo Company, an all-human unit recently arrived from Earth. Their commanding officer, Captain Rebecca Morrison, was a veteran of the Covenant conflicts on 3 different worlds. "Your reputation precedes you, Krell Tar," Morrison said during our first briefing. "Sergeant Chin speaks highly of your tactical abilities." The compliment was unnecessary, but not unpleasant. "Chin's squad performed admirably during our patrol," I replied, though their methods were sometimes unconventional. Morrison smiled, an expression I had learned indicated amusement or approval among humans. Unconventional is one word for it. We prefer to think of it as adaptive. The training exercise was a simulated assault on a fortified position, with human and Vorthak forces working in coordination. Standard doctrine called for a methodical advance with overwhelming firepower, minimizing casualties through superior equipment and careful planning. The humans had different ideas. Captain Morrison's plan relied heavily on small unit tactics and individual initiative. Squad leaders were given broad objectives rather than specific instructions. Soldiers were expected to adapt to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from higher command. But what if they make incorrect decisions? I asked during the planning phase. Individual judgment is inherently unreliable. Morrison considered this. "Sometimes they'll make mistakes," she acknowledged. "But more often than not, a soldier on the ground has better information than a commander watching from orbit. We train our people to think, not just follow orders." The concept seemed inefficient, even dangerous. Yet when we ran the exercise, the human squads moved with fluid precision that impressed even my Vorthak compatriots. They adapted to obstacles, exploited opportunities, and supported each other with minimal communication. More significantly, when Corporal Hayes was killed by a simulated enemy fire during the assault, his squad immediately modified their approach to account for the loss. They redistributed his ammunition, adjusted their formation, and continued the mission without missing a beat. But I noticed something else. The quality of their performance improved. They moved faster, hit harder, and took greater risks. They were fighting for Hayes, even though he was only simulated dead. After the exercise, I found myself in conversation with several human soldiers. They spoke freely about their motivations, their fears, their hopes for the future. Private Anderson told me about his plans to become a teacher after his military service. Sergeant Williams described her daughter's upcoming wedding. Corporal Kim shared pictures of the house he was building for his parents. They all had lives beyond the military, connections that extended far beyond their immediate unit. Yet rather than weakening their commitment to the mission, these personal attachments seemed to strengthen their resolve. They fought not just for abstract principles or military objectives, but for the right to return to the people they loved. The revelation was profoundly disturbing to me. Vorthak warriors served the Empire because we were bred and trained for no other purpose. We had no choice in the matter, no alternative path to consider. These humans had chosen to be here, knowing they might die far from home, far from the people who mattered to them. That night, I composed a message to the Vorthak High Command, detailing my observations about human tactical capabilities. But, as I wrote, I found myself struggling to explain what made them effective. Their physical limitations were real and significant. Their technology was adequate, but not exceptional. Their training was thorough, but not superior to other coalition species. What set them apart was something intangible, something I lacked the vocabulary to describe properly. They fought with an intensity that seemed to transcend mere military obligation. They treated their squad mates as family, their mission as a sacred duty, their enemies as personal threats to everything they valued. They fought like they had something to lose. The thought haunted me as I completed my report. In Vorthak culture, emotional attachment was considered a weakness, a distraction from duty. We prided ourselves on our objective rationality, our ability to make calculated decisions without the interference of sentiment. But watching these humans, I began to suspect that our supposed strength might actually be a limitation. We fought efficiently, but they fought desperately. We calculated acceptable losses, but they refused to accept any losses at all. We served the Empire because it was our function, but they served each other because they chose to. Which approach was truly superior remained an open question, one that would require further observation to answer. But I could no longer dismiss human capabilities as simply the result of ignorance or primitive emotion. There was something deeper at work here, something that transformed these fragile creatures into formidable warriors, something that I was only beginning to understand, and something that would challenge everything I believed about the nature of warfare itself. 3 months after Martinez's evacuation, our combined forces received orders for a deep reconnaissance mission into Covenant-controlled territory. The objective was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution: penetrate enemy lines, establish observation posts, and gather intelligence on their strategic capabilities in the Proxima system. I had been permanently assigned to work with human units following my reports to High Command. My observations about their tactical adaptability had generated significant interest among Vorthak strategists, though I suspected they still viewed humans as interesting curiosities rather than serious military assets. Captain Morrison briefed our combined force in the cargo bay of the transport ship Endurance. The mission would last 30 days with no possibility of resupply or extraction until completion. We would be operating behind enemy lines with minimal support, relying entirely on our own capabilities for survival. The Covenant has been reinforcing their positions in this sector for 6 months, Morrison explained, gesturing to the holographic display that showed enemy troop movements. Intelligence suggests they're preparing for a major offensive against our installations on Kepler 438b. We need to know what they're planning and when they plan to do it. The mission parameters were well within acceptable risk factors for Vorthak forces. We had conducted similar operations hundreds of times across dozens of systems. Yet as I studied the human faces around me, I detected an emotional undercurrent that my species would never display before a dangerous mission. They were afraid, but they were also eager. The combination seemed contradictory to my logical mind, yet I had learned to recognize it as a uniquely human trait. They understood the risks they were taking, but they embraced those risks as part of their duty to protect their comrades and their homes. Sergeant Chun had been promoted following her performance during our previous patrol. She now led a reconnaissance team that included several soldiers I had worked with before, Rodriguez, Johnson, and Singh among others. They greeted me with genuine warmth, as if I were a trusted friend rather than an alien observer. "Good to have you back, Kreltar," Chun said, offering the peculiar human gesture of striking palms together that they called a handshake. My species did not engage in casual physical contact, but I had learned to reciprocate this ritual. The squad hasn't been the same without our resident tactical genius. The designation was inaccurate. I possessed no special abilities beyond standard Vorthack training. Yet the humans seemed to view my analytical approach to combat as exceptional, even though it was simply how my species naturally functioned. Their tendency to attribute unusual qualities to ordinary capabilities was another puzzling aspect of their psychology. We deployed to the surface of Proxima 3 under cover of darkness, using stealth insertion pods to avoid enemy detection. The planet's surface was a nightmare landscape of volcanic activity and toxic atmospheric conditions. The Covenant had established their base here precisely because most organic species found the environment uninhabitable. Humans required environmental suits to survive the sulfurous atmosphere, adding another layer of vulnerability to their already fragile physiology. Yet as we moved across the hellish terrain toward our first objective, they adapted to the conditions with remarkable speed. Within hours, they were moving with the same fluid precision I had observed on more hospitable worlds. Our first week passed without significant contact with enemy forces. We established 3 observation posts overlooking major Covenant supply routes and began collecting intelligence on their movement patterns. The data confirmed intelligence estimates about their force strength, but also revealed something troubling. They were bringing in far more equipment than necessary for a simple offensive operation. "They're not planning to attack our installations," I told Morrison during one of our evening briefings. "They're planning to hold this entire system permanently." Morrison studied the reconnaissance data with growing concern. "How can you be sure? The supply ratios are wrong for an assault force," I explained. "They're bringing in construction equipment, long-term provisions, and defensive emplacements. This is not a temporary occupation." The implications were staggering. If the Covenant could hold the Proxima system, they would control a critical junction in the galactic shipping lanes. Coalition forces throughout this sector would be cut off from resupply and reinforcement. Dozens of human colonies would be left defenseless. "We need to get this information back to command," Morrison said. "This changes everything." But before we could arrange extraction, our mission took an unexpected turn. On the 8th day of surveillance, Rodriguez detected movement near our primary observation post. A Covenant patrol had discovered one of our concealed sensor arrays and was following the signal back to our position. 6 contacts, moving in standard search formation, Rodriguez reported quietly into his communications device. "They know we're here, but they don't know exactly where." Standard operating procedure called for immediate withdrawal when detected. Vorthack doctrine emphasized avoiding unnecessary contact with superior enemy forces. But she made a different decision. "We can't abandon the post," she said. "The intelligence we've gathered is too important. We hold position and eliminate the patrol." I questioned the wisdom of this choice. The risk of discovery is too high. If even one enemy escapes, they will bring reinforcements. "Then, we make sure none of them escape," Chin replied with a coldness that reminded me she was a professional killer, despite her earlier displays of compassion toward Martinez. The ambush was planned and executed with precision that impressed even my analytical mind. The humans used the terrain to their advantage, creating overlapping fields of fire that left the Covenant patrol with no avenue for escape or retreat. When the engagement began, it lasted less than 30 seconds. 6 enemy soldiers died without returning effective fire. Their communications equipment was destroyed before they could transmit a warning. Their bodies were concealed in a volcanic fissure where they would never be found. To outside observers, the patrol had simply vanished without explanation. But as we dragged the last body to its hiding place, something happened that I had not anticipated. Private Johnson, who had performed flawlessly during the ambush, suddenly collapsed to his knees and began vomiting violently. Johnson, she knelt beside him, her voice filled with concern. "What's wrong?" Johnson tried to speak, but could only point at the body he had been carrying. It was a young Sangaili, probably not much older than a human adolescent. Johnson had put 3 rounds through its chest at close range, killing it instantly. Johnson gasped between waves of nausea. "I've never killed anyone that young before." The statement confused me. The enemy's age was irrelevant to tactical considerations. A young warrior could be just as dangerous as an experienced one, sometimes more so because of their unpredictability. But the humans seemed to place special significance on the youth of their enemies. Shin placed her hand on Johnson's shoulder, a gesture of comfort I had seen humans use frequently. "He was trying to kill us, Johnson. You did what you had to do." "I know," Johnson replied, though his distress was still evident. "I know that. It reminds me of my little brother." I observed this exchange with growing fascination. Johnson had performed his duties perfectly, eliminating a threat with professional efficiency. Yet he was experiencing what humans called guilt over actions that were both necessary and appropriate. The emotions served no tactical purpose, yet his squad mates treated it as completely natural and acceptable. Rodriguez offered Johnson water and rations, while Singh quietly took over his watch duties without being asked. The squad accommodated his temporary weakness without judgment or criticism. They seemed to understand that emotional responses to violence were normal, even expected, among their species. This tolerance for emotional vulnerability challenged my understanding of military efficiency. Vordak warriors who displayed such reactions would be immediately reassigned or eliminated from combat units. We viewed emotional distress as a fundamental failure of conditioning and training. Yet as I watched Johnson gradually recover his composure and return to full effectiveness, I began to suspect that the human approach might have advantages. By acknowledging and accepting emotional responses to violence, they prevented such reactions from becoming debilitating psychological wounds. Johnson was upset by what he had done, but he was not traumatized by it. Over the following days, I paid closer attention to how the squad dealt with the stress of constant danger. They talked about their feelings openly, sharing fears and concerns without shame. They supported each other through moments of weakness and celebrated small victories together. They maintained their humanity even in the midst of inhuman circumstances. The contrast with Vordak methods was stark. My species dealt with stress through rigid discipline and chemical suppression. We viewed emotional expression as weakness and enforced strict behavioral conformity. We were efficient, but we were also isolated from each other in ways that seemed increasingly problematic as I spent more time with humans. On the 15th day of our mission, we received an encrypted message from Coalition Command. A major Covenant fleet had been detected approaching the system, confirming our intelligence about their permanent occupation plans. Our mission parameters changed from reconnaissance to sabotage. We were to destroy as much enemy infrastructure as possible before extraction. The new objectives required us to abandon our concealed positions and conduct direct action against heavily defended targets. The risks increased exponentially, but the humans embraced the challenge with enthusiasm that bordered on eagerness. Finally, Rodriguez said as we planned our first attack, "I was getting tired of just watching those bastards." The target was a supply depot located in a heavily fortified compound. Intelligence suggested it contained enough ammunition and equipment to support a full division for several months. Destroying it would significantly impact the Covenant's ability to maintain their occupation force. The assault required precise coordination between multiple teams attacking from different directions simultaneously. Any failure in timing or execution would result in the entire force being trapped and eliminated. Yet as I watched the humans prepare for the attack, I saw no hesitation or doubt in their faces. They checked their weapons with methodical care, reviewing the plan repeatedly until every detail was memorized. They shared personal items and messages to be delivered to loved ones if they did not survive. They prepared for death with the same thoroughness they applied to planning the mission itself. "You seem troubled, Krell-Tar," Chin observed as we waited for the attack to begin. "Second thoughts about the mission?" "I do not understand your species," I admitted. "You know this attack will likely result in casualties, yet you show no fear." Chin considered this carefully. "Oh, we're scared," she said finally. "Anybody who isn't scared in a situation like this is either lying or crazy. But being scared doesn't mean we can't do the job. Fear is a survival mechanism," I pointed out. "It should motivate you to avoid dangerous situations, not embrace them." "That's where you're wrong," Chin replied. "Fear doesn't make us run away. It makes us fight harder to protect the things we care about. The more scared we are of losing something, the more desperately we'll fight to keep it." The attack began at midnight, coordinated by precise time-keeping devices that ensured all teams struck their targets simultaneously. The humans moved through the enemy compound like shadows, eliminating sentries and disabling security systems with lethal efficiency. But when the explosives detonated and secondary fires began consuming the ammunition stockpiles, everything went wrong. The blast was larger than anticipated, collapsing part of the facility and trapping 3 members of Rodriguez's team under debris. Enemy reinforcements arrived faster than expected, surrounding our extraction point and cutting off our escape route. Standard military doctrine called for immediate withdrawal, leaving the trapped soldiers behind to prevent further casualties. The mission had been successful, the depot was destroyed, and the strategic objectives achieved. Continuing to fight would only waste additional lives for no tactical gain. But Chin refused to abandon her people. "Rodriguez, Singh, Williams," she called over the radio. "If you can hear me, hold tight. We're coming for you." "Negative." Rodriguez's voice crackled through the static. "Structure's too unstable. Get out while you can." "I said we're coming for you," Chin replied, and there was something in her voice that made it clear the discussion was over. What followed was the most intense combat I had ever witnessed. The humans fought with desperate fury, knowing that every minute their comrades remained trapped increased the chances of the structure collapsing completely. They took enormous risks, charging through enemy fire and using explosives with reckless abandon to clear a path to the collapsed section. Johnson, who had been struggling with guilt over killing the young Sangaili, led the charge through the heaviest enemy resistance. He moved like a creature possessed, his earlier emotional vulnerability transformed into implacable determination. When his rifle ran out of ammunition, he continued fighting with a sidearm. When that ran dry, he used his knife. Private Anderson, the one who planned to become a teacher, single-handedly held off an entire enemy squad while the rescue team dug through the rubble. He was wounded 3 times but refused medical attention until the trapped soldiers were freed. The rescue took 40 minutes that felt like hours. When they finally pulled Rodriguez, Singh, and Williams from the collapsed building, all 3 were injured but alive. The cost had been enormous. Half the squad was wounded, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and enemy forces were closing in from all directions. But they had saved their people. All of them. No one was left behind. The extraction under fire was a running battle across 3 kilometers of hostile terrain. The humans carried their wounded without complaint, sharing ammunition and equipment as needed. They fought a disciplined withdrawal that would have impressed even veteran Vorthack commanders. When we finally reached the extraction point where our transport waited, I conducted a quick assessment of the unit's condition. Every human was wounded to some degree. Several were barely conscious from blood loss and exhaustion. Their equipment was damaged, their uniforms torn and bloodied. Yet as they collapsed into the transport's cargo bay, their first concern was for each other's welfare. They shared medical supplies, water, and food without regard for their own needs. They celebrated their survival not as individuals, but as a group that had remained intact against impossible odds. Mission accomplished, Chin reported to Captain Morrison with obvious satisfaction. Depot destroyed, all personnel accounted for. Morrison reviewed our situation with obvious relief. Outstanding work, Sergeant. All of you. The intelligence you gathered and the infrastructure you destroyed will save thousands of lives. As the transport lifted off and carried us away from that hellish planet, I found myself profoundly changed by what I had witnessed. These humans had accomplished their military objectives, but they had also demonstrated something far more significant. They had refused to accept the unacceptable. They had risked everything to save 3 soldiers who were already considered lost. They had fought not just for victory, but for each other. And in doing so, they had revealed what true terror meant. It was not the fear of death or injury that drove human warriors to such extremes. It was the fear of losing someone they cared about. The fear of having to explain to Martinez's children why their father wasn't coming home. The fear of leaving Rodriguez buried under rubble on an alien world far from his family. Terror, for humans, was the possibility of failing their obligation to each other. And that terror made them capable of things that defied all rational military analysis. As I composed my mission report during the journey home, I struggled to explain this revelation to my superiors. How could I make them understand that human weakness was actually a form of strength? That their emotional attachments, rather than limiting their effectiveness, were the source of their greatest tactical advantages? The Vorthak Empire had conquered 17 star systems through superior technology and disciplined application of force. We were efficient, logical, and utterly ruthless in pursuit of our objectives. Yet watching these fragile humans fight for each other, I began to suspect that we had missed something fundamental about the nature of warfare itself. We fought for the Empire because it was our purpose. They fought for each other because it was their choice. And perhaps that difference would prove more significant than anyone yet realized. The war changed 6 months later when the Covenant launched their full-scale invasion of the Terra Nova colonies. What had begun as border skirmishes and reconnaissance missions suddenly escalated into a conflict that would determine the survival of human civilization in this sector of the galaxy. I had been reassigned to serve as liaison officer with a newly formed Combined Arms Regiment, a joint human-alien unit tasked with defending the critical supply hub at New Geneva. The posting was intended as an honor, recognition of my expertise in human tactical doctrine. But as I watched refugee ships fleeing the outer colonies, their cargo holds packed with civilians who had lost everything, I understood that this assignment would be unlike anything in my previous military experience. The defense of New Geneva was meant to be a textbook operation. The planet was heavily fortified with orbital defense platforms and ground-based artillery installations. Coalition fleet elements provided additional security in space, while ground forces prepared defensive positions across the planet's single continent. Yet from the moment I arrived at the command center, I could sense something different about the human personnel. The easy camaraderie I had observed during patrol missions was replaced by a grim determination that seemed to radiate from every soldier, technician, and support worker on the base. Colonel James Harrison, the overall commander of human forces, briefed me on the strategic situation during my first day on planet. The holographic displays showed Covenant fleet movements that painted a clear picture of encroachment and inevitable assault. They're not just trying to take territory anymore, Harrison explained, his voice heavy with implications I was only beginning to understand. Intelligence indicates they're planning complete extermination of human populations in this sector. No prisoners, no negotiations, no quarter given. The concept of genocide was not unknown to galactic civilization. Many species have been eliminated throughout history when they proved incompatible with dominant cultures or technologies. The Vorthak Empire itself had absorbed or destroyed dozens of lesser civilizations during our expansion period. But those have been calculated decisions based on resource allocation and strategic necessity. This was something different. This was the systematic elimination of an entire species for reasons that appeared to be purely ideological. The outer colonies are gone, Harrison continued, his fingers tracing the progress of Covenant forces across the tactical display. Proxima 7, Kepler 442b, the mining stations in the Centauri belt. Everything. Nearly 2 million civilians killed in the first wave alone. 2 million. The number was large enough to be abstract. Yet as I watched the human faces around the briefing room, I could see that each loss was personal to them. They were not just calculating military casualties. They were mourning the death of their species. "What are your orders, Colonel?" I asked, applying standard Vorthak protocol to gather essential information. Harrison's expression hardened. "Hold this position at all costs. New Geneva is the last major supply hub between here and Earth. If it falls, the entire front collapses and the core worlds will be defenseless." The strategic importance was obvious. But as I studied the force dispositions and enemy capabilities, I realized that holding the planet would be virtually impossible against the fleet strength the Covenant was bringing to bear. We were facing annihilation odds with insufficient resources to mount an effective defense. Any rational military commander would have begun planning for evacuation and withdrawal to more defensible positions. Yet Harrison showed no signs of considering such options. Neither did any of his subordinates. They were preparing to fight a battle they could not win, against an enemy that would show them no mercy, in defense of a position that might already be doomed. The illogic of it troubled me until I encountered Sergeant Chen again 3 days later. She had been transferred to New Geneva along with the surviving members of her reconnaissance team, now expanded into a full company of veteran soldiers with experience fighting Covenant forces. "Kreltar." Chun greeted me with obvious pleasure as I toured the defensive perimeter. "I heard you were assigned here. Should have known they'd want our tactical genius for the big show." Her casual confidence seemed misplaced given our circumstances. "Sergeant, are you aware of the force ratios we face? Enemy fleet strength alone could eliminate our orbital defenses within hours." She nodded, her expression growing serious. "Yeah, we know the odds. Command's been pretty clear about what we're up against." "Then why do you seem so optimistic?" Chun considered the question carefully as we walked along the defensive line. Human soldiers were digging fighting positions, checking weapons, and preparing obstacles with methodical thoroughness. Their faces showed concentration and determination, but none of the despair I would have expected from troops facing certain death. "You remember Martinez?" Chen asked finally. "The soldier who was wounded on our first patrol together." "Yes. He came home 3 weeks ago. Full recovery, back with his family on Earth. His little girl, Maria, she's learned to walk while he was gone, sent us a video message showing her taking her first steps." The information seemed irrelevant to our current tactical situation. "I do not understand the significance." Chen stopped walking and turned to face me directly. "Martinez is alive because we refused to leave him behind on that moon. His daughter is taking her first steps because we fought to get him medical attention. That's what we're fighting for here, Kreltar. Not just territory or strategic positions. We're fighting for the right of human children to take their first steps." The emotional logic was still foreign to me, but I was beginning to recognize its power. These soldiers were not simply following orders or fulfilling military obligations. They were defending something precious to them, something that gave meaning to their existence. "The Covenant wants to exterminate us," Chen continued. "Every human man, woman, and child in this sector of the galaxy. They want to erase us completely, as if we never existed. But we exist, Kreltar. We matter. And we're not going to let them wipe us out without the fight of our lives." Over the following week, I observed the human defensive preparations with growing fascination. They were not simply building military fortifications. They were creating a fortress that would serve as the tomb of human civilization if necessary, but which they were determined to hold until the last possible moment. Every position was designed for maximum defensive value, even if cut off from supporting units. Ammunition and supplies were distributed redundantly so that individual strongpoints could continue fighting independently. Medical stations were equipped to treat massive casualties while remaining operational under direct fire. But more than the physical preparations, I was struck by the psychological transformation I witnessed among the human personnel. They were preparing to die, but they were also preparing to make that death count for something significant. Private Johnson, who had struggled with guilt after killing the young Sangaili, had become a squad leader renowned for his tactical innovation. He spent hours studying Covenant assault patterns, developing counter-tactics that maximized defensive effectiveness against superior numbers. Rodriguez had been promoted to sergeant and now led an entire platoon of combat engineers. His specialty was creating improvised explosive devices from salvage materials, turning every approach to the human positions into a potential killing field. Anderson, the former teacher, had requested transfer to the communications section, where his ability to remain calm under pressure made him invaluable for coordinating defensive fires and calling in air support. Each of them had found ways to contribute that went beyond their original training or assignments. They were no longer just following orders. They were personally invested in the outcome of the battle in ways that transcended normal military motivation. The Covenant fleet arrived on the 23rd day after my posting to New Geneva. Long-range sensors detected their approach 6 hours before they reached orbit, giving us time for final preparations and last messages to loved ones. I watched human soldiers record video messages for family members they would likely never see again. They spoke with calm acceptance of their fate, but also with fierce pride in what they were about to accomplish. They were not victims facing slaughter. They were warriors choosing to make a final stand. "Tell Mom I love her," one young soldier said to his recording device. "Tell her I died fighting for something that mattered. Tell her that humans don't give up, not ever, not as long as one of us is still breathing." The sentiment was repeated in dozens of variations as soldiers across the base said goodbye to their previous lives and prepared for what was coming. They faced annihilation with dignity that impressed even my analytical mind. The orbital bombardment began at 0347 local time. Covenant ships took positions outside our defensive envelope and began systematically destroying military installations with surgical precision. Our orbital platforms returned fire valiantly, but were overwhelmed within the first hour of engagement. As enemy fire rained down from space, the human defenders took shelter in prepared positions and waited for the ground assault they knew would follow. The bombardment lasted for 6 hours, reducing much of the base infrastructure to smoking ruins while somehow leaving the core defensive positions largely intact. When the first Covenant dropships appeared on the horizon, the humans were ready for them. The initial assault waves met withering defensive fire that stopped them hundreds of meters from the perimeter. Human artillery, carefully concealed and camouflaged, emerged from hidden positions to tear gaps in enemy formations. Improvised minefields channeled surviving attackers into predetermined killing zones where machine gun nests and sniper positions waited in ambush. But the Covenant forces kept coming. Wave after wave of assault troops, supported by armor and air power, pressed attacks against different sections of the perimeter. They seemed willing to accept unlimited casualties to overwhelm the defenders through sheer attrition. By the end of the first day, human forces had inflicted devastating losses on the attackers, while suffering relatively light casualties themselves. Yet everyone understood that this was only the beginning. The enemy had virtually unlimited reinforcements, while every human loss was irreplaceable. On the second day, the Covenant changed tactics. Instead of frontal assaults against prepared positions, They began using infiltration teams to attack supply lines and command centers. Small groups of elite warriors penetrated the defensive perimeter under cover of darkness, striking at critical targets before melting back into the chaos of ongoing combat. It was during one of these infiltration attempts that I first witnessed what humans call berserker rage in actual combat. A Covenant strike team had penetrated to the main ammunition depot and was preparing to destroy it with explosive charges when Sergeant Rodriguez arrived with a handful of combat engineers. The enemy team consisted of 6 Sanghaili warriors, each armed with energy weapons and close combat blades. They had superior equipment, better training, and advantageous position within the depot. By any rational analysis, Rodriguez and his men should have withdrawn and called for reinforcements. Instead, they attacked immediately. Rodriguez led the charge with nothing but a sidearm and a combat knife, moving with speed that seemed to defy human limitations. His men followed without hesitation, firing as they advanced through enemy positions. The engagement lasted less than 2 minutes and ended with all 6 Covenant warriors dead. But the cost was severe. 3 of Rodriguez's men were killed in the assault, and Rodriguez himself was badly wounded by an energy sword that had sliced through his body armor. As medics worked to stabilize him, he insisted on personally checking every explosive charge to ensure the depot was safe. "Can't let them take the ammo," he gasped through obvious pain. "Squad needs those rounds." The depot was saved, but at a price that illustrated the brutal mathematics of attrition warfare. Every successful defense cost human lives that could not be replaced. Every tactical victory brought them closer to strategic defeat. By the end of the first week, the defensive perimeter had contracted by nearly 30%. Entire sections of the base had been abandoned as casualties mounted and available personnel decreased. Yet the remaining defenders continued to fight with undiminished intensity. I found myself assigned to increasingly desperate missions as the situation deteriorated. My analytical capabilities made me valuable for planning counterattacks and defensive adjustments, but I also began participating directly in combat operations. During a night raid, to eliminate a Covenant artillery position that was decimating our southern defenses, I experienced something that fundamentally altered my understanding of human nature. The assault team consisted of 12 soldiers led by Lieutenant Sarah Walsh, a young officer who had been promoted in the field after her predecessor was killed. The target was a heavily defended emplacement protected by energy barriers and automated defensive systems. Intelligence suggested it was defended by at least 30 enemy troops with access to air support if they called for assistance. Walsh's plan was audacious to the point of seeming suicidal. Rather than attempting stealth or subtlety, she proposed a direct frontal assault that would rely on speed and violence of action to overwhelm enemy defenses before they could respond effectively. "We hit them fast and hard," she explained during the brief planning session. "No hesitation, no second guessing. We go in like we're already dead and make them pay for every meter of ground." The attack began at midnight with a brief artillery barrage that served more to announce our presence than to cause significant damage. Then, Walsh led her team in a running charge across 500 meters of open ground, while enemy fire filled the air around them. I had never experienced anything like it. The humans moved like a pack of predators, covering each other instinctively while advancing through hostile fire. When Private Torres was hit and fell, 2 soldiers immediately moved to support him, while the rest continued the assault without missing a beat. Walsh herself was struck twice by energy bolts, but continued fighting until the objective was secured. Her left arm hung useless at her side, but she directed the placement of demolition charges with her right hand while blood soaked through her uniform. "Set the charges for 30 seconds, she ordered through clenched teeth. "We need to be clear before their reinforcement arrive." The artillery position was destroyed, eliminating a major threat to our defenses. But as we withdrew carrying our wounded, I realized that I had witnessed something that transcended normal military courage. These humans had attacked a superior enemy force not because they expected to survive, but because they knew their sacrifice would protect their comrades. They fought with the desperation of creatures who understood that defeat meant extinction, not just for themselves, but for everyone they cared about. And that desperation transformed them into something far more dangerous than any military training could produce. The siege continued for another 2 weeks. Each day brought new assaults, new casualties, new tactical challenges that pushed human defenders beyond their apparent limitations. Yet somehow they continued to hold their positions, inflicting disproportionate losses on enemy forces while maintaining coherent defensive operations. I began to understand why the Covenant had committed such massive resources to eliminating humanity from this sector. These were not the weak, fragile creatures I had initially observed. When pushed to the edge of extinction, humans became something else entirely, something that posed a genuine threat to any enemy that underestimated their capabilities. On the final night of the siege, with fewer than 200 human defenders remaining from an original force of nearly 3,000, I received an unexpected communication from my Vorthack superiors. A relief fleet was en route to New Geneva, but it would not arrive for another 72 hours. We had to hold for 3 more days with forces that were already at the breaking point. Colonel Harrison gathered his surviving officers for what everyone understood would be the final briefing. The command center had been relocated to an underground bunker after the original facility was destroyed, and the holographic displays now showed enemy forces massing for what appeared to be a final assault. "They know we're finished," Harrison said quietly. "They're going to throw everything they have at us tomorrow morning and end this once and for all." The tactical situation was hopeless. Ammunition was critically low, medical supplies exhausted, and defensive positions severely compromised. Any rational military force would have surrendered or attempted to negotiate terms for evacuation. But as I looked around the room at the faces of the human officers, I saw no acceptance of defeat. They were exhausted, wounded, and outnumbered, but they were not broken. They were planning to fight until the very last moment, not because they expected to win, but because surrendering was simply not an option they could consider. "The relief fleet will arrive in 72 hours, Harrison continued. "Our job is to make sure there's still something here for them to relieve when they get here." Sergeant Chun, now the senior NCO for what remained of the enlisted personnel, raised her hand. "What about civilian evacuation, sir? The refugee camps still have nearly 10,000 people. Evacuation ships left this morning," Harrison replied. "We bought them enough time to get clear. Whatever happens here, those people are safe." The information seemed to satisfy something in the human psyche that I was only beginning to understand. They had accomplished their primary mission, protecting innocent lives. Everything else was secondary to that fundamental objective. As the meeting broke up and officers returned to their units, Chen approached me with an expression I had learned to recognize as serious concern. "Kreltar, you should know that tomorrow's going to be different from everything we've done before. If you want to withdraw to a safer position, nobody would blame you." The suggestion that I might abandon my post was puzzling. My orders are to serve as liaison with human forces. I will remain at my post. Chen smiled, but it was not an expression of happiness. "That's not what I meant. Tomorrow we're going to fight like cornered animals. It's not going to be pretty, and it's not going to be honorable. We're going to do whatever it takes to buy those last 72 hours. I was beginning to understand what she meant, but I needed to hear it stated clearly. "What exactly are you telling me, Sergeant?" "I'm telling you that you're about to see what humans are really capable of when we have nothing left to lose. And I'm not sure any of us will recognize ourselves when it's over." The final assault began at dawn, exactly as predicted. Covenant forces attacked from all directions simultaneously, supported by massive artillery barges and airstrikes that reduced the remaining defensive positions to scattered strongpoints surrounded by enemy forces. What followed was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was a series of individual last stands as small groups of human defenders fought to the death in isolated positions throughout the base. They used every weapon available, including improvised explosives, captured enemy equipment, and hand-to-hand combat when ammunition ran out. I watched Sergeant Chun lead the defense of the communications bunker with a mixed force of technicians, medics, and walking wounded. When enemy troops breached the outer defenses, she directed the destruction of critical equipment while organizing a fighting withdrawal to secondary positions. But when the Covenant forces brought up flame weapons to clear the remaining defenders, something changed in Chen's demeanor. She had been maintaining professional composure throughout the siege, but seeing her wounded soldiers being burned alive triggered a response that was purely primal. She emerged from cover with nothing but a sidearm and began advancing directly toward the enemy flame teams. Her movements were precise, calculated, and utterly without regard for her own survival. She killed 7 Covenant warriors in close combat before taking multiple hits that finally brought her down. Yet even as she died, her actions inspired the remaining defenders to continue fighting with renewed intensity. They rallied around her sacrifice, using her example to find strength they did not know they possessed. Throughout the base, similar scenes were playing out as human defenders reached the limits of conventional military behavior and discovered something deeper. They fought not just as soldiers, but as members of a species facing extinction, drawing on reserves of determination that seemed to have no bottom. When the relief fleet finally arrived 73 hours later, they found 57 human survivors holding a defensive perimeter that covered less than 2% of the original base. The Covenant assault forces had been so badly mauled that they were in the process of withdrawing when coalition reinforcements engaged them. As I stood among the ruins of New Geneva, surrounded by the bodies of both friends and enemies, I finally understood what true terror meant. It was not the fear that drives creatures to flee from danger. It was the fear that drives them to become dangerous themselves. Humans had shown me that when faced with extinction, intelligence and technology meant nothing. What mattered was the willingness to pay any price, endure any sacrifice, and become anything necessary to protect what you valued most. And that willingness made them the most terrifying species I had ever encountered. Not because they were strong, but because they refused to accept defeat even when facing impossible odds. Not because they were fearless, but because their fears drove them to fight with desperate intensity that could overcome any rational calculation. In my final report to Vorthack Command, I recommended immediate reassessment of our relationship with humanity. Not because they were valuable allies, but because they were potentially dangerous enemies. A species that could fight, as I had witnessed at New Geneva, could not be safely ignored or underestimated. They had taught me the meaning of terror, and in doing so, they had earned something I had never expected to feel toward any alien species: respect.